This issue of like removing things or wiping the commemorations to the Soviet times, whether it's the occupation, or even just the fact that they would have these memorials to defeating the Nazis, right?
Yep.
Isn't there a balance between like wiping history and also trying to remember?
Do you see in Europe Nazi symbol around? Do you have monuments of Hitler? You don't. Answer. That's the answer.
But your context is a bit different.
No, the context is not different. Just the reason that you don't know the context doesn't make it different. Stalin killed thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. Russians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, 1956, Hungary, 68, Czechoslovakia. It's the same content, exactly the same content. And indeed, we have not been removing everything because it was a nice way also to explain to people how totalitarian regimes work.
I'm in Estonia, a country on the front lines of the NATO alliance, where I'm meeting the former president, a woman who could be NATO's next chief and willing to do whatever it takes to defend her nation.
Inside the city center was a memorial of the Soviet soldier, but then Russia started to use it to kind of create this Ruski Mir.
That was the bronze soldier, right?
Yeah, exactly. But still we didn't demolish it like now Latvians did, for example, in the center of Riga. We moved it to the cemetery. So we have been really kind with these memorabilia. But if the context changes, you have to do something to establish yourself as an independent state. Because, I mean, these people who live here still, I mean, they have to understand also history. They have to have our side of history as well. And we are not ready to say, forget it.
And who are they? You mean the Russian speakers who are more aligned towards
They're not
the
even
side?
aligned. They simply don't know, I mean, what was here before the Second World War. And they don't know also the horrors of occupation. People love freedom. And actually, I think this was the miscalculation of Putin, that he thought truly and really that Ukrainian people don't care whether they live in a free country or in a kind of Soviet-style country. But people do care because they also remember what does it mean to live under Soviet occupation, and everybody here has absolutely no doubts that Soviet occupation equals Russian occupation.
Shall we go travel to your office?
Okay.
President Kaljulaid, good to have you on the InnerView. It's a strange, dynamic, and maybe anxiety-ridden time for your country. Tell me how you're processing everything that's going on right now.
Yes, indeed, it is true that the whole free world is now really worried about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And this, I am quite sure, matters to the whole world, because all autocrats are watching what is going on. So if you ask about our worries, then our worries probably are of the same magnitude, like for people in Berlin. Berlin and Kiev are the same distance as Tallinn and Kiev, by the way. So we're all in Europe, of course, very worried. First and foremost about what happens to Ukrainian people, genocide, deportations, killing, horrible things going on. But also, we must all understand that the free world has to win. Has to win, has to help Ukraine to win. So in a way, Ukraine is fighting for all of us, and the mindset in Estonia, for example, helping Ukrainians, 5% of Estonian population today are Ukrainians, refugees. The mindset is we have to help with everything we can. And we spent about 1/3 of our defense budget this year, for example, in supporting Ukrainian fight against aggression, which is unprecedented and totally unexpected in 21st century.
Your defense minister has still said that despite Ukrainian victories on the battlefield, people shouldn't underestimate Russia's power on all levels. So I wondered, when you think that you've spent almost 40% of your military budget, a big chunk of your GDP in helping the Ukrainians, what's the message to those who would assume that victory after victory from the Ukrainians would mean that eventually the Russians will give up and go back home?
Expect the worst. I mean, there is no rationale in what Russia is doing. No rational kind of logic in anything what they're doing. And therefore you cannot predict. But what we can do is we can support Ukraine with everything they need to win, indeed, this war, to liberate their territory. And let's imagine one day that this day dawns, that Ukraine is whole and free. Ukraine has made it very clear, seeing also that Russian army is not quite what maybe the whole world expected, that they can regain the integrity of their territory totally. One day this has happened, then the ball is back in our courts, the free world's court, because unless there is a true regime change in Russia, I don't think we should go back to business as usual.
You say there's no rationale.
No.
If you'll allow me, let me try and
Get into Putin's head.
get into their heads, or at least take them at their word based on what they say, related to not necessarily you as Estonia, not necessarily specific countries on the border,
Yeah.
but NATO and the United States.
Mhm.
Okay, NATO is exactly like the Soviet Union was with Cuba in the 1960s, and the Americans saw that the Soviets were supporting Cuba and on their doorstep with nuclear missiles, and they were encroaching, and they, just as it was unacceptable to the Americans back then, it's unacceptable to Russia today, not the Soviet Union, that NATO, led by the Americans, their old enemy with nuclear weapons, is right on their doorstep and can attack them at any time, is pointing a loaded gun at their heads. That's a rationale that we hear from them.
May I first respond to that rationale? There have been lots of pretexts which actually were very hard to find out as lies before this aggression. Today it is very easy to prove Russia is not afraid of NATO. You know how? There are no troops at NATO's borders from Russia's side. And if Russia were really even 1% worried about NATO's attack on its territory, it wouldn't have depleted totally its borders with Norway, Finland, soon to become NATO member, Baltic states, Poland. There are no Russian troops in our region, practically. Which is very interesting to notice. If you go to the Chinese side of Russian military capabilities, they're still there. Putin, you lied to everybody. You say you're afraid of NATO. Now your lie has been caught out. You are not afraid of NATO. Otherwise, you wouldn't act while doing something in Ukraine, really leaving, undefended your NATO's border. This lie was a lie, and now it's proven that it was a lie.
So then what's the point of getting Finland and Sweden as new members of NATO?
That is Finnish and Swedish people's decision, and obviously they must feel that in order to, for long term, not only for short term, to be protected and defended, is indeed to join NATO. What I'm speaking about is what spot in time. Russia needs all its forces in Ukraine. We noticed that already in the beginning of the war, it's not kind of current attempt only to save what can be saved in Ukraine. We noticed that the armed forces were removed from behind our borders. Previously, there was a considerable build-up. In 2009, what was then exercise Zapad, these levels in 2015-16 were kind of daily natural levels of capabilities behind our borders. So there was considerable build-up. Indeed, that was maybe meant to prove to the world that they are indeed worried about NATO's expansion to their borders. But within this year, this lie has been caught out.
Article 5.
Yes.
That's the protective umbrella for NATO members. You are a member of NATO. You're a small country. You're on the border with Russia. Article 5 sometimes to me sounds like Article of Faith 5, because people talk of it as if it's a guarantee that if anybody attacks any NATO member, then this whole military power, the largest military alliance in the history of mankind, just activates and will defend whoever. Do you truly believe that that will be the case?
Yes, of course we do believe. And it was also, people were very much like, do you really believe?
But at the risk of World War III.
Now this year it's very easy to say that even Finns and Swedes believe. Obviously it must be true, therefore, because they are bigger nations, more major nations, Nordic nations, by the way, very well able to defend themselves. They fulfill all the criteria necessary for Article 3, because Article 3 comes before Article 5. You must be ready to defend your own territory, and only then comes the Allied support. Article 3, the closest definition we have to it is spending at least 2% of your GDP on defense, which Estonia has been doing. It's very important for us that we are not consumers of the safety and security. We are contributors. We provide capabilities which are suitable for small nations. We've been always at the forefront of NATO's cyber cyber domain development, and we actually host the biggest cyber range globally, and NATO Center of Excellence on cyber is in Estonia and so on. So we are adamant that we are not consumers only, we contribute as well. We contribute with understanding of our adversary, whom now we could also well call, using stronger words. Previously it was always adversary. Just in the previous NATO's concept, just the one before, Russia was not even adversary. So things have changed sadly very quickly, but indeed we are adamant that we also contribute to the common security and safety. But of course, there are capabilities which smaller economies cannot provide for, and unfortunately or fortunately, some of the smallest economies within NATO are exactly its border nations, Baltic states. There are small ones within, but we don't notice. For example, Luxembourg. There is even a neutral one who de facto benefits from NATO umbrella, which is Austria, who is not even a member of the NATO, of course. But so there are very geographical situations. But you know, when people get so worried about all this geopolitics, I always say that look, if you compare living in a geopolitically seismic region to living in a really seismic region, then you have one advantage. Japan may prepare however much they want. The next earthquake comes. When our deterrence is ready and prepared, the war will not come.
Do you feel ready and prepared?
NATO has an amazing ability to adapt and change its deterrence capabilities. I mean, when Crimea was occupied, NATO immediately decided to ramp up its capabilities, but also its signaling. Because if you look at EFP, force-wide, it's not so big, but there are more than 20 NATO member countries involved in providing enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states, and now EFP has also expanded to the southeast NATO members. This means that, I mean, the signal was very clear. Thousands of NATO soldiers in the border nations do not dare. So deterrence went up. And it also provided NATO with the capabilities to understand better how exactly you defend these territories. Because let's imagine we'd had an Article 5 situation unexpectedly without EFP having exercised and trained here. Many people from Central Europe would have come with their tanks and they would have sunk in the bog because they simply didn't know that you do not drive a Leclerc or another tank into the bog. It doesn't come out from there. Maybe in the winter when it all freezes over, they can dig it out. So, I mean, NATO and NATO's troops have learned a lot about terrain and a lot also about interoperability and our capabilities to interoperate and also the problems we have with interoperation. And therefore, I would say that EFP has not only served as a deterrent tripwire, but also like a permanent exercise, which NATO has learned a lot about. And we've noticed, for example, that if we now exercise at the strategic level with our allies, then previously most strategic level exercises had a game plan which had something like somebody comes across the border and then things start moving at NATO level in the games. Now it is like there is a signal that something is moving within Russia which we don't understand. All the layers already start moving. I mean, everybody is very much aware that we have to be prepared, we have to be informed and ready to act and react. And this is the best we can do to defend ourselves. And we are adamant that NATO is the best we have. And we are also happy with the Madrid decisions. Of course, the devil is always in implementation. So it's not like you decide in Wales or Warsaw or Madrid or wherever, and then things just magically happen. It takes a lot of work to get things done. But we are very happy with how NATO has reacted.
Is Putin an autocrat? I mean, just
He's responsible for genocide, so he's not only autocrat, but he's an autocrat responsible for genocide in Ukraine.
You made an attempt to talk to him?
Yes,
a few years ago?
Yes, he's a leader of my neighboring country.
I saw the tweet. Basil, can you pass on the tweet? Yeah, this was interesting in my research. I came across this. I mean, you can have a look at it. Actually, would you mind reading it to us?
Yes, met with President of Russia. Better to talk to each other rather than about each other. Even if we know that we agree to disagree on several principal issues, two neighbors always have common issues to resolve and interests to pursue. I can actually explain.
Tell me.
Vocabulary to vocabulary. Better to talk to each other rather than about each other. Do you know what it means? Baltic states, Russia.
That was 2019.
Yeah, Russia Russian president and the Estonian president had not met for 25 years, which led to the situation that when, for example, German or Finnish president was talking to Russian president, then they always asked us to want us to pass a message. So we felt like on the menu, not behind the table. This put us behind the table. I don't know why Putin agreed to it. I'm sure his Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually disagreed to allow Baltic states behind the table, not on the table. Because this is a big part of Russian foreign policy principles. Are countries about whom we talk and countries with whom we talk. With this move, we moved ourselves to the countries with whom they talk. Next, we know that we agreed to disagree on several principal issues. Yes, we did discuss Ukraine, Crimea, and Georgia. Third, two neighbors always have common issues to resolve. For example, our railroad contract had run out. We have the fifth biggest lake of Europe is the border lake of us. These technical issues we've always been talking about, so we need to. So indeed, when COVID broke out, I called Putin. I was closing borders between, Finland-Estonia border was partially closed, similarly Estonian-Latvian border, and much more closed the Russian border. Called them all. These kind of things we did. But again, then he hadn't done what he now has done, so now things are different, of course.
In retrospect, was that still the right decision to meet with him to talk?
Yes, and the reason why it was the right decision was that much more, previously when we said, look what Russia is doing, we cannot trust them, everybody would say, you don't even talk to them, how do you know? This argument was taken from our own partners by this meeting. Yes, I do talk to him as well, and I don't know.
What was it like to meet with him? Did he listen to you? Did he respect you?
Yes, because it was his decision to accept my proposal. This meeting happened so that we were renovating our embassy. Our oldest embassy actually is in Moscow. Renovated it and it was ready, and we met in Paris. Well, not met, we were all there for Armistice Day, and I just went up to him and asked that should we sometimes meet? We have an embassy which has been renovated. I might come to Moscow and open it for you to decide whether you want to discuss or not. He wanted. And that's how it happened. And indeed, my ambition was then actually to change even more our position among our own partners. That we do talk to Russians, and we still see that what they did in Georgia and what they were doing in Crimea might have a sequence. So actually it made our position stronger in Europe, not that much vis-a-vis Russia. We didn't have high expectations. We discussed basically quite a long time technical issues of electricity grid, gas, all these things, which basically we are in the frequency area of Russia. We're leaving by 2025. I also explained to him how we are leaving, why we are leaving, and all these things. So, and this was our discussion. Technical was easy. More sensitive issues, of course, they weren't easy. It was a discussion. A meeting like meetings are. Lots of media presence, of course, lots of media interest as well.
Throughout this discussion, you've spoken a lot about the fact that your country has often been warning the world about Russian aggression, the way they behave.
Not often. We started more 2008 because there we put 2 and 2 together immediately. 2007, Medvedev was president, and in Munich Security Conference, Russia came out with a proposal to redesign the international security order. And their proposal was then to kind of take distance from Helsinki Acts and be more power-based, more kind of interest-based, to accept that, big nations have big interests in neighborhood and so on. And the world said no, of course. And in 2008, then Georgian war happened. And then we accepted the facts on the ground, by which we taught Russia that we don't negotiate the world order, but if you act to change the world order, meanwhile also stopping all discussion about Georgia acceding NATO and EU, we do nothing. And I think that is why Crimea even happened. So we did indeed, we were far more worried in 2008 that there will be a sequence, and we were convinced after 2014 that there will be a sequence. And if we are not able to stop this regime now and isolate it, then there will again be a sequence. Might be Moldova, we don't know.
And I wonder how much of this is you reacting to the past, Soviet Union, Soviet occupation, and is there an argument to be made that you have to deal with what's in front of you and not the past, despite the traumas of the past, the occupations and so on?
I mean, it depends on what has happened to the former occupier. I mean,
is Putin's Russia really the former Soviet Union? I know your own prime minister now, her family was sent to Siberia, right? So of course
mine was.
Everybody's family, right? So everybody has this personal trauma, personal history.
Absolutely. My grandmother was not only sent to Siberia, but arrested for anti-Soviet activities because she met some of the old student time friends who came from Sweden over to Estonia in 40s, 47, 25 plus 5 years for anti-Soviet activities.
Wow.
Stalin died, so she escaped after 9 years in Norilsk.
Are you dealing with Stalin and the Soviet Union, or are you dealing with Putin's Russia, which is a different dynamic?
It's not different dynamic, and that's the biggest error of 90s, actually. But frankly speaking, we here, we were far more optimistic probably than West about democratic developments in Russia. I refuse, to this day, I refuse to accept that a big Slavic nation is not capable of democracy. I think it is. And in 90s they had a chance, but West didn't help it. And the West could have helped it as it helped Germany after the Second World War to process what they had done. Instead, Russia took distance from Soviet Union and said, we are not Soviet Union. It was Soviet Union who did terrible thing, and it also killed many Russians, which is true. I mean, Stalin and Brezhnev, they all sent also Russians who were dissenting to Gulag. And everybody said, okay, we accept it. But in fact, we should have insisted that the history of the Soviet Union would involve the atrocities the Soviet army did in Germany, in occupied territories, but even Germans didn't talk about it freely at that time. Only now, this summer, when I was returning from Ukraine and there were some Germans in the train, they started to talk about the horrors. And they said, you know, we didn't just talk about these things for a while. It was not comme il faut, obviously, to discuss, but they had also, they were so afraid of Russians coming to their villages that people, well, this is what Germans told me, committed massive suicides and killing their own children and themselves, not to be in the hands of Russians. So it is the same thing. And the pattern was the same in Georgia, the pattern was the same in Crimea. We chose not to see it, but it was the same. And indeed we expected and we hoped Russia has changed, and we were seeing the autocratic tendencies creeping back in and so on. And we really worried about it. And in 2008, our worries were proven true. But I mean, we're not happy about it. Frankly speaking, we really didn't expect it to turn so bad. So for us, the biggest tragedy, geopolitical tragedy of 20th century is that Russia didn't really change in 90s. And it didn't really change because the free world did not tell them that, hey, we don't trade with you unless you really change.
Russia didn't really change, in your view. That's your message. At the same time, can you assure your ethnic Russian citizens of Estonia, the Russian speakers, those who have deep connections with their brethren across the border, that they are respected and loved and they are part of Estonia?
Frankly speaking, I think it is very hard today to be Russian in whole Europe, probably the whole world. Maybe comparable to being a US citizen in 1947 in Japan. But again, is it our fault?
Well, Russians don't get visas to come here.
Yeah, but I mean, what I want to say is, if they are there already, I mean, many are, you know, Germany has 2 million Russian speakers, for example. I mean, I'm sure that simple people unfairly suffer the policies of Vladimir Putin today, because simple people on the other side are not able to have all these kind of distinctions in place. It's not your fault, it's regime, and so on, so on. I think it is kind of human nature.
Your parliament declared Russia a terrorist state. How do you think that resonates with people who are ethnic Russians?
I wanted to come to that. You know which one of my statements on any kind of radio channels got almost the highest number of comments from foreign countries? You know, remember Salisbury?
Yeah,
I was
the chemical.
Yeah, I was in UK a couple of months probably after that. And everybody was like, you have so many Russian-speaking people, aren't you afraid something terrible might happen? They must all support Putin. And then I was like, look, if something went really wrong in your country, dictatorship happens, has happened globally in many places. Would you stop loving your language, your poetry, your culture, your food traditions, and your grandmother who still lives in the country if you choose to emigrate? The answer is obvious, no. So, I mean, our citizens here who are Russian speaking, or even Russian citizens who live here. Many, by the way, have come in the last years because they don't like Putin's regime. Our people who have, been born here and are former citizens of Soviet Union, many are now Estonian citizens, many have grey passports, some have chosen Russian citizenship. They love their freedom too.
Looking at your own personal situation, your own personal ambitions, your vocation moving forward, I've tried to study how NATO chooses its next leader. It seems to be more opaque than the cardinals choosing the Pope at the Vatican. Are we to expect you to be a front runner come the back end of 2023?
It's a tough question for many Eastern European politicians, including our own Prime Minister here in Estonia and me, because many people think it's time for a woman and from 2004 enlargement country to lead NATO. And probably when NATO leaders come together and decide one of us could serve, then everybody would be ready to serve. But indeed, this is not the discussion we are in any way part of right now, apart from, of course, our Prime Minister and Minister of Defense and our ambassadors. When things start to move ahead, they will start to vet their ideas about it. What are their ideas? Actually, I have absolutely no idea. So for me, this is all media speculation right now. But I'm very grateful for media to pointing out that I might have actually the capabilities to lead NATO. On the other hand, Jens Stoltenberg has been fantastic as NATO's Secretary-General. We were grateful to him. And his ability to kind of forge this common ground has been fantastic and massive. And I'm very grateful to Jens for having done this job so long, so nicely.
Kersti Kaljulaid, I wish you all the best, and I'm very grateful that you took the time to talk to us. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.
All the best.